Up next, it's Eva Bartlett, and Eva will be doing all 5 events that we're on tour now. This is the first of 5 nights, then we'll be finishing in Manchester on Monday. But Eva will be doing all 5 events, so could we have a big round of applause for Eva Bartlett.
Thank you all very much, and thank you for inviting me and for all the excellent speeches so far. It's really been a very informative night. I speak to you this evening not as an expert, but as a person who spent extensive time in 2 of 3 places I wish to address tonight, occupied Palestine and Syria. And the 3rd place I also want to speak in brief on is Korea's north, which I visited only, albeit for a week, but it was enough time to get some basic insights and to interact with people there. But I also speak to you as an American citizen, so Peter Kuznick is not the only Yank on the panel tonight. I hold dual citizenship, and so I hold dual culpability for the actions of my governments, because Canada is by no means innocent in all these imperialist wars and occupations. One other thing I want to stress before getting into things is that in all these areas, and of course other areas may be still addressed tonight, it is the voices of civilians, and Reverend Ashdown did touch upon this. It is the voices of civilians in these areas that are completely silent by the media, by the corporate media. They're completely devoid in corporate media reporting. And that's, since I got involved in activism in occupied Palestine 10 years ago, that's been my main objective, is to, as much as possible, relay the voices of people I met in Palestine, in Syria, in Lebanon, and also in Korea. And I do that, again, without pretending to be an all-knowing expert, but just as honestly as possible conveying those voices. So there are some commonalities, and forgive me if I miss some, but some commonalities of the victim nations of imperialism. The commonalities of the victims of imperialism. And some of these are, well, Korea's north was completely destroyed by the US alliance in the 50s. Syria has been invaded by imperialist forces and their proxy terrorist mercenaries, and has been greatly destroyed in many areas, particularly Raqqa, and also in other areas of Syria, due to this war that Syria did not ask for and would not have occurred if it hadn't been fomented by the Western alliance. These nations are treated as criminals. Palestinian unarmed protesters are called terrorists by the Israeli and by Western media. Western media justifies the Israeli brutality on unarmed Palestinian protesters, including sniping unarmed protesters in their backs or slaughtering medics. The Israeli media and government justify this by calling them terrorists. And the Western media calls these clashes, when you have heavily armed elite Israeli snipers firing on unarmed Palestinian civilians. These are not clashes, it's murder. North Korea is as a whole demonized. We are told to forget the history of the West's bombings in North Korea. We are told that people in North Korea are robots and don't have minds of their own, and their leader is a madman that wants to destroy everybody in the West. We are never given that historical context of the murder, according to General Curtis LeMay, of at least 2 million North Koreans due to the US and Allied bombings. And at the same time as the people in these nations or their governments are demonized, the actual perpetrators of war crimes, of genocide, their crimes are whitewashed by our media. Al-Qaeda and other terrorists in Syria are called rebels, and the atrocious acts they've committed, beheadings, mass rapings, kidnappings, and point-blank assassinations of civilians, let alone what they've done to Syrian security forces, are whitewashed by our media. Turkey, Israel, and the US coalition's illegal attacks on Syria and Syrian civilians, killing hundreds, which is a modest estimate, and destroying much of the infrastructure in these areas they've attacked, is whitewashed by the media. And as I mentioned, Israel's murders of unarmed protesters, also journalists and medics, and Israel's forced expulsion, ethnic cleansing of over 700,000, that's also a conservative estimate, over 700,000 Palestinian civilians, Israel's use of white phosphorus on Palestinian civilians. These are all whitewashed by the media. And I was living in Gaza in 2008, 2009, during the Israeli massacre of Palestinians at that time, and I documented myself, and many others also did, Israel's use of white phosphorus on civilians, including on shelters housing internally displaced civilians who literally had nowhere to run, nowhere to hide, and including on homes and other neighborhoods throughout Gaza. And Israel to this day has never been held accountable for its use of white phosphorus, which I'm sure you're aware of, burns to the bone. There's no way average people can put out a white phosphorus fire. Israel's never been held accountable for these murders and the maimings of civilians. And let's remember, and I believe this was already mentioned, the sanctions on Syria and the sanctions on Iraq, which Madeleine Albright deemed worth it. The killing of 500,000 Iraqi children was worth it to achieve the imperialist goals in Iraq. And I should note that recently the Atlantic Council, the arm of NATO funded by US, awarded Madeleine Albright with a Freedom Award. And that award is for people who defend and advance the cause of freedom around the world. The glaring hypocrisy of the media and the Western leadership could not be more blinding, I suppose. Regarding the North Korea or the DPRK, as I mentioned, the US General Curtis LeMay said, he stated about the killing of at least 2 million North Koreans, and he said, we burned down every town and village in North Korea. We killed 20% of the population of Korea. We threatened to launch thermonuclear warfare against them. But it didn't end then. Since the 50s, the US has repeatedly threatened the very existence of Korea's North, including threatening Korea with nuclear destructions 6 times between 1970 and 2010, and that's according to a US think tank called the Stimson Center. And more recently, I'm sure you're aware, in September 2017, standing in the United Nations General Assembly, President Donald Trump vowed to destroy North Korea. Before him, Colin Powell in 1995 threatened to turn North Korea into a charcoal briquette, and he repeated that threat in 2013. But the thing is, it was already turned into a charcoal briquette by US and allied bombings. The capital city, Pyongyang, and cities around the country were destroyed by at least 635,000 tons of bombs, including 32,557 tons of napalm. Sanctions enforced since that time made it almost impossible to rebuild in North Korea, but they did rebuild. And that's one of the things visitors to North Korea will notice. In spite of the sanctions, in spite of what we're told is mass poverty all around the country, Koreans have managed to rebuild some very elegant and graceful buildings, providing free housing for its citizens, and also providing remarkable educational facilities for its citizens, not only in Pyongyang, but around the country. 28,500 US troops occupy South Korea with 38 military installations, and every year, at least twice a year, hundreds of thousands of troops stage military drills simulating the attack of North Korea. So imagine you're in that country that's having these drills simulating your attack. You never know when it will be real. And as a side note, I will add, in Gaza, Israeli flyovers, F-16 flyovers, sometimes the sound is a sonic boom, and sometimes it's a bomb. You never know until it hits. And so this psychological terror is another aspect of the terrorizing that the West, the US and its allies have been doing to North Korea and Israel has been doing to Palestine. Historian Bruce Cummings wrote, "The demonization of North Korea transcends party lines. Drawing on a host of subliminal racist and orientalist imagery, no one is willing to accept that North Koreans may have valid reasons for not accepting the American definition of reality. And we're meant to believe that the leader is a psychopath. And as I mentioned, we don't hear the Korean people's side, that they're aware of their history and that they don't want to be obliterated again, and they're going to do everything in their power to resist that." So as Peter Kucinich noted, the US won't tolerate a nation having a self-defensive deterrent. He said something to that effect, but this is the thing with North Korea. It's going to defend itself, and the US won't tolerate the fact that it has a deterrent. And like Russia, China, Korea's North won't be cowed by the West. In January 2018, I interviewed Ajam Mubaraka, who was a 2016 nominee for the role of the US Vice President, and he's also a longtime anti-war activist. And he said, the US should not feel that it has a moral and political right to intervene to determine who should be head of state, what kind of system they should organize. Those are questions and issues that should be left up to the people of any nation state on the planet. No matter what the argument may be made by US authorities regarding the character of any state, we believe that allowing for those kinds of arguments to be used as a justification for intervention or waging war is morally unacceptable and politically has to be resisted. And this applies to virtually every war the US and its allies are waging around the world. So to save some time, I'll skip ahead onto Syria. And I'd like to note, I really appreciated Reverend Andrew Ashtown's speech. It was very informative and very moving because he really did touch upon issues that Syrians face that our media will not report. For example, he gave excellent information on what Syrian civilians had experienced in eastern Aleppo under the rule of Al-Qaeda, Nuruddin al-Zinki, and other terrorist factions. And also on the fact that corporate media largely didn't report on this. In fact, I recall that corporate media, as Aleppo was being liberated, corporate media was saying Aleppo was falling. And I don't see how in the world one could say Aleppo under Al-Qaeda rule is falling, when if you go to Aleppo now, you'll see peaceful Aleppo. You see civilians walking freely in areas if they dared to walk before, they would have been slaughtered, they would have been sniped, they would have been kidnapped. And Reverend Ashton also touched on the important work of the Reconciliation Ministry, the movement in Syria. When I was in Syria in June 2017, I met with the Reconciliation Minister because I was interested in going to Madaya and Al-Wa'ar. Al-Wa'ar is in Homs, and Madaya is just southwest of Damascus. And both had recently returned to peace after such reconciliation processes. And so I did go to those areas, and similar to East Aleppo and then later on Ghouta, what I heard in Madaya and Al-Wa'ar was that civilians there had been starving, and it was because the terrorist factions there had control of all food and all aid that came in and made the prices so unaffordable that most people resulted to eating whatever pickings they could find, but they couldn't afford to buy from the terrorists. But also, and when I was in Madaya, I actually saw some of the food aid, and interestingly, a box of the food aid, ICRC and I think Syrian Red Crescent, this box was just outside a bomb-making factory, a factory where terrorists had been manufacturing mortars and missiles to fire on the Syrian army and civilians below, because Madaya is in a hillside. So this food aid parcel was just outside the bomb-making factory, and I was told that they had been storing the food aid just above the bomb-making factory. If you recall, in April 2016, I believe, yes, April, all we heard was Madaya is starving, and all the incriminating fingers were pointing at the Syrian and Russian governments. But when journalists went, prior to liberation and after, as it turned out, Syrian civilians blamed the so-called rebels, the terrorists. But in June 2017, the Reconciliation Ministry told me at that time, over 85,000 Syrians had gone through the reconciliation process. And these include Syrians who were militants and Syrians who were wanted for other reasons. And they had returned to their civilian lives. And Reverend Ashton very correctly asked, why didn't the corporate media report on the 11,000 civilians in Damascus who have been killed by mortars and other shelling over the years? And I echo him and add the same for Aleppo, because over 11,000 civilians were killed there by terrorist mortars, by their hell cannons, which are gas canisters fired from cannons, by sniping. Why weren't we told about this? I had to go to Aleppo to learn that there wasn't a last doctor in Aleppo. There were over 4,000 doctors and 800 specialists. But our media didn't tell us this. They said it was a last doctor in Aleppo. Right now, the southern government province of Syria called Daraa is being liberated by the Syrian army and allies. And I'm not sure about UK media, but other Western media are saying the same things we heard about Aleppo and Ghouta. They're saying Daraa is falling and we have to save Daraa. I went to Daraa in May this year, and when I went, it was very dangerous to go because of the proximity of Al-Qaeda and other terrorists on either side of the highway, and because of the fact that Daraa was being shelled by these terrorists. And locals took me to a school that had been heavily shelled, and that in one direction was, they said, 150 meters from terrorist snipers. And obviously we didn't stand there too long, but then they took me along a road nicknamed 40 Martyr Street, because at least 40 civilians had been killed on the road, excuse me, from shelling or from sniping. And then I went to visit the state hospital. Many of the wards in the state hospital, including the children's ward, the gynecology ward, the operations room, the pharmacy unit, are off limits or destroyed from terrorist shelling or sniping. And even being there and taking photos of that and hearing what the medical staff had to say about these areas was dangerous. So imagine how it is for Syrian civilians who need medical care, and other hospitals in Daraa have been destroyed or off limits, and the only choice is to go along a road along which you're at risk of being sniped by the so-called rebels that are bringing freedom and democracy to Syria. So Daraa right now is going through this process of liberation and reconciliation. And I believe Reverend Ashton noted that there are many instances in which reconciliation is offered, but it's turned down by these factions. And reconciliation and the humanitarian corridors are the most humane way to end the terrorism. And I honestly cannot imagine America offering such humanity. In May, when I was in Daraa, I met Father George Rizik. He's a Greek Orthodox priest. He said, "I've lived in Daraa since 1994. 15 years before the crisis, we used to warn our brothers and sisters in Daraa al-Balad, be careful. There's a foreign plan prepared for this country, and they will use the ordinary Muslims in Daraa al-Balad to implement this plan." We saw what was happening in the world, what was being prepared in the world. It was clear from Condoleezza Rice, who talked about the so-called Arab Spring and creative chaos. This was 4 years before the crisis, so 4 years before 2011. It means that there was a systematic program to destroy countries in the Arab region. And he goes on talking. And interestingly, this is something that Canadian author Mahdi Nazemroaya wrote about in 2006. And he went on to elaborate about the Middle East project. And I highly doubt that Father George was reading Mahdi Nazemroaya's writings. It more reflects on Syrians and how aware they are of what's really going on in their country, and how this has been a premeditated war on Syria. Journalist Sharmeen Narwani wrote, one of her articles was called "How Narratives Killed the Syrian People." And she wrote, on March 23rd, 2011, 2 young men, Sahar Yahya Mirhaj and Habil Anis Tayoub, were gunned down in the southern city of Daraa, so March 23rd. They were 2 regular soldiers in the ranks of the Syrian Arab Army. Shot by unknown gunmen, Mirhaj and Tayoub were the first of 88 soldiers killed throughout Syria in the first month of the conflict, in Daraa, Latakia, Douma, Banyas, Homs, Muadamiyah, Idlib, Harasta, Suwaida, Taklaha, and the suburbs of Damascus. So her article obviously details more about this, but she also wrote another article, excellent, called "The Hidden Massacres," which go into depth about these murders that our media wasn't reporting about. And at that time, our media was telling us the Syrian government, the Syrian security forces, are gunning down unarmed protesters in Daraa and then elsewhere. On my last visit to Syria in April and May this year, I met a Dr. Amr Gantous, who is based in a military hospital about 40 kilometers from Daraa city. And he told me an incident regarding the lies of Qatar-owned Al Jazeera. And he said, it was the second or third Friday in March, so second, third Friday of protest in March. He said he had been told by the general at the hospital, because it was a military hospital, the general had said to all the staff, your priority is to treat civilians first. Because if civilians come in, they get priority over any wounded soldiers or security staff. And he said that day there was a large number of doctors, his services weren't needed, so he was sitting in a room watching TV, which happened to be Al Jazeera, and drinking coffee. And he said Al Jazeera was reporting that the hospital was turning away civilians. And according to Dr. Gantous, this was totally untrue. They were admitting civilians. And then Al Jazeera said there were no doctors in the hospital, which was also untrue. And I asked him, where was Al Jazeera getting their information? He said, well, I saw women filming with their mobiles. And I asked him, but in 2011, in Daraa, southern Syria, who had the capability to live stream with mobiles? And I made the point that I have a Samsung 7, and I was using Syria phone card, which has internet data, and I really don't think I could have live streamed in 2018. Perhaps I could have, but in 2011, who had the ability to live stream? And in hindsight, we know that there were foreign groups like Avaz and other groups that were giving classes and giving technology to Syrian civilians before events began in 2011. And so I think perhaps that's one answer to my question. Regarding Duma, I won't talk too much about this because it has been mentioned. And Ambassador Ford rightly noted that after the April 7th accusation of a chemical agent or nerve agent being used in Duma, the US, UK, and France illegally bombed Syria prior to any investigations being held, and actually on the eve when the OPCW investigators were to arrive in Syria. And one of the areas they bombed was in Damascus, an area called Berzeh. And in that area, I think it was hit with 79 missiles, or it was fired, 79 were fired at it. How many hit, I don't know. But that area is in Damascus, and it's not off to the side, it's in Damascus. So assuming there had been some sort of chemical weapons and the US and allies bombed that facility, wouldn't it have created mass murder in Damascus? But in any case, according to the Syrian government and according to the OPCW itself, it didn't contain any chemical weapons or anything related to that, and the OPCW had gone there previously. And that facility, with regard to sanctions, that facility was apparently involved in making medication for cancer treatment. And under sanctions, my understanding, having visited a cancer association in Aleppo, they said they had a difficult time getting appropriate treatment and nutrition for their children because of the sanctions. But back to Duma. On April 26, 17 civilians from Duma, including medical staff and a young boy, 11 years old, named Hassan Diab, who was featured in an unverified video that was used to incriminate the Syrian government, they testified at the OPCW headquarters at The Hague, and they said there was no chemical attack. And they gave their testimonies as to what happened that day. But the corporate media dismissed their testimonies and called the fact that they had been brought to testify obscene, and they called it a masquerade. But let's recall that this same media took for gospel the words of a 7-year-old girl who we know is being exploited by her family and by Western governments and by the corporate media, Bana al-Abid. Our media took her words, apparently her words, allegedly her words, and allegedly her tweets as gospel truth from Aleppo. And yet, when civilians and a 7-year-old boy speaking in his own language testify, our media calls it a charade. When I went to Duma in early May, I think it was, or late April, I met with Marwan Jaber, who was a medical student who was present on the day that allegedly chemicals were used. And he, as other medical professionals in Duma and other civilians have said, he said there was no chemical. He said people came in being treated for normal shelling injuries, asphyxiation, difficulty breathing, and they were treated as such. He said while medical staff were treating people who came in, strangers, he called them, came in, and if you've seen the unverified videos, you will see among them people wearing a white helmet's emblem. White helmets, I'm sure you're aware of, are a Western propaganda construct. And he said that when the strangers came in, they were screaming about chemical weapons and everybody went into panic mode, but then medical staff calmed them down because they realized what they were seeing was not the effects of a chemical weapon or nerve agent. And the patients were dispatched home. But yet his testimony and the words of journalists who went before me, including Robert Fisk and including our colleague Vanessa Beeley, and journalists who went after me, all these testimonies have been dismissed by corporate media because it doesn't fit their narrative. And their narrative was to incriminate Syria and Russia because at that time, almost all of Eastern Ghouta had been liberated and was being restored to peace. And the West just could not have that. They had to send more freedom and democracy and Western intervention to Syria. But in Duma, I also walked around the streets and talked with civilians and asked them, well, did they think a chemical weapon attack had occurred? And all I met said no. And bear in mind, I was conversing with them in Arabic, but also with a translator present to make sure I wasn't making any mistakes. And I also asked them about rule under life under the rule of Jaish al-Islam, and they talked about horrific public executions by sword, by targeted assassination, and they talked about starving, again, due to Jaish al-Islam, and that's notable because Douma is surrounded by agricultural fields. So even if the narrative that the Syrian government was starving people in Douma, if the terrorists hadn't been starving them, they could have been living off the land. But they were prevented from accessing the land by the terrorist factions, according to the civilians I met. On July 6th, the OPCW, this body that was supposed to investigate the accusations that Syria had used a nerve agent in Douma, reported that no organophosphorus nerve agents were detected in the prioritized samples they had taken, including from alleged casualties. So this is rather notable because all the think tanks and experts and Bellingcat and State Department funded human rights groups and corporate media told us specifically the Syrian government for sure used sarin or some other nerve agent to kill civilians in Douma, and yet the body tasked with investigating says no, there was no nerve agent present. And they did investigate scenes from these unverified videos. I'd like to note one major discrepancy in a previous OPCW report on alleged chemical weapons usage, this time in Khan Sheikhoun in 2017. This report had what they called irregularities. They mentioned this kind of in a footnote. Now, here's one of the irregularities. The admission of 57 victims to hospital before any alleged attack occurred. Other irregularities were sarin showing up in urine, but not in blood test from the sample. So that's certainly something to make you question, if you aren't already questioning, the official narrative on what happened on these alleged chemical attacks in Syria that always occur at times that the Syrian government would have no need whatsoever to use chemicals, even if they wished to. In brief, I'll talk about Gaza. I spent 3 years in Gaza. And as I mentioned at the beginning, my primary objective was to report what corporate media wasn't reporting. As it happened, I was in Gaza during the 2008-2009 Israeli bombings, and I mentioned the use of white phosphorus. Israeli soldiers also point-blank assassinated civilians, including children. I took horrifying testimonies from parents who saw their children being assassinated. But what we don't hear so much of is the systematic targeting of the breadwinners of Gaza, the fishers, the farmers, the people that work in the borders. Gaza has been in the news of late during the Great March and the Great Return marches, and due to the Israeli assault on unarmed protesters. But the fact is, Palestinians in Gaza have been protesting for years. The Israeli land theft, the Israeli siege policies, the Israeli starvation policies of civilians in Gaza. And when I lived there, I joined a number of these protests, and I usually walked at the front because, unfortunately, well, in this case, I suppose it's fortunate, the racism of shooting a Palestinian but not always shooting a non-Palestinian means that I could be with them at the front, and perhaps in some cases, because of my presence, maybe the Israeli army wouldn't shoot the Palestinians that day. That didn't always work. They sometimes shot around us. But in joining the Palestinians on these marches, what I saw every time was men, women, including older women, including children, including elderly men, and young men, youths, walking to the border area in question and chanting freedom chants and chanting about their land. There was no violence. The Israeli military would pull up in jeeps and start firing with live ammunition on these protesters. Or they would fire from remote military towers. So these towers are remote controlled and they look like a dome, and they open up and fire with great precision on unarmed civilians in these areas. And it's not just protesters. There are people that work in the border regions to collect rubble to be used in rebuilding because Israel prohibits cement from entering Gaza. There are people that catch birds in the border region. And there are farmers. And the farming sector in Gaza has been decimated, not only by the Israeli attacks on farmers, but by their systematic destruction of wells and cisterns in the border region. They've made it virtually impossible for Palestinians to live off the land. And they've made it virtually impossible for Palestinians to live off the sea, because Palestinians, although they should be able to fish 20 miles off the coast, are limited to 3 miles, 2 miles. They will go out in a tiny little boat called a Hasaka. They'll paddle out, and the Israelis will open fire on what is a clearly unarmed Palestinian. And they do this to fishing trawlers. They abduct fishermen, they destroy trawlers, or they steal trawlers. It's decimated the fishing and agricultural industries. Every time they pound Gaza, they decimate the infrastructure. They destroyed the only power plant in Gaza in 2006, and since then haven't allowed them to rebuild. And so everything the Israelis do, every policy, is another layer of manufactured misery that is completely preventable. And yet they're doing this to make Palestinians reliant on food aid, to make Palestinians cow in. But Palestinians are not cowing. They're standing up to one of the most brutal armies and governments of the world. And they're doing so to the relative silence of the media. I'll wrap this up. I know we're short on time. But I'd like to say, I'd like to just refer to Neil Clark, a journalist who was with us on the first Imperialism on Trial. And he said, when you come out against Western foreign policy, it puts you open to a lot of attacks. We're actually putting forward, I think, very reasonable positions. We don't want to illegally invade countries. We don't want to topple governments around the world. And yet the way the media is framed, it's that we are the way the media is framed, it's we are under attack. We are the people who are portrayed. Anyway, again, I'll skip through this. We often forget when we talk about conspiracy theorists, is that the biggest piece of fake news, the biggest conspiracy theory we've had in the last 20 years was the one told to us that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction in 2003. And he pointed out, next time you hear a neocon come up and talk about Russia Today pumping out fake news, it wasn't RT that pumped out this fake news about weapons of mass destruction. It was Western media. In addition to attacks, many of us who speak out have been attacked by corporate media. I would venture that pretty much everybody on this panel has been attacked by corporate media. And it's not only been corporate media, but so-called anti-imperialist activists, analysts, think tanks. But there's also the strange case of Philip Cross and his obsessive Wikipedia edits on dozens of anti-war, anti-imperialist voices. And I am pretty sure, again, people on this panel, including myself and others, including George Galloway, Craig Murray, John Pilger, Vanessa Beeley, Neil Clark, and many, many others, have been edited by this Philip Cross character, whose sole purpose seems to be to demonize any people who are anti-imperialist and to, on the other hand, make credible the very voices that are putting forth these imperialist narratives and that are supporting wars on sovereign nations. But my feeling is, in spite of the social media censorship and the Wikipedia smears and the incessant cyclical attacks by corporate media, my feeling is that we are making a difference because they wouldn't bother with us if we weren't. Why do they attack us if we're so off the radar, if we're so unimportant? And by we, I don't mean us, I mean everyone who's standing up and everyone who's challenging the corporate narrative. And so when people ask what can we do and how can we change the system, while there's no single answer, I do think the next time you see a war propagandist, particularly one who hasn't set foot in the country in question, next time you see one of these people smearing a journalist, an analyst, somebody who's taken the time to research and write in depth about these issues, please call them out. Make them realize that we don't buy their propaganda and lies anymore. The differences between corporate media, NATO think tanks, State Department affiliated human rights groups, and those of us who actually do our utmost to report honestly, who go to the places in question, is that we actually do care about the civilians in Syria, Yemen, Palestine, and elsewhere, and we care about the civilians in our own countries. We don't seek war, we don't seek death. We seek peace, we seek a return to stability. We seek an end to imperialist wars and occupations. We seek justice and the basic fundamental human rights for all. And we seek for the voices who have been silenced by corporate media to be heard. Thank you.
Absolutely wonderful speech there by Eva again, just like with her first speech at our first Imperialism on Trial in Derry on January 30th. and how beneficial it is to have someone who has had first-hand testimony in countries, and like she says, that has actually been on the ground in the countries, unlike what most of corporate media who haven't been on the ground. So just before I welcome the next guest, Adam Gary, it's kind of similar with the event in Derry that I had heard John White speaking many times on our